Hey folks, before we start today, I'd love to briefly mention my favorite new podcast. It happens to be, coincidentally, our new weekday show called, appropriately, The Next Big Idea Daily, hosted by my dear friend, Michael Kovnat, he of the mellifluous baritone. It really is phenomenal. Check it out wherever you get your podcasts.
LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, the delightful, disturbing, and downright fascinating story of the human mind. Paul Bloom is no fan of textbooks.
I would never write a textbook. I wouldn't want to read a textbook.
Which is kind of funny because Paul is a professor. He's taught psychology for decades, first at Yale and now at the University of Toronto. And despite his professed loathing of textbooks, he recently found himself wanting to write a book that would capture
basically everything I know about the mind.
Sounds an awful lot like a textbook, right? Except what Paul ended up writing is unlike any textbook I was ever forced to slog through back in school. For one thing, it's actually fun to read. It's brisk, accessible, occasionally bawdy, and thoroughly unputdownable. It's a joyride of a book, and it's called Psych, the Story of the Human Mind.
I'm honest about the limitations of psychology, our failures, our embarrassments, what we struggle to explain. But I also get to talk about our discoveries, everything involving memory and language and mental illness and consciousness and reasoning, emotions, the whole shebang.
This is exactly the kind of book we love here at the Next Big Idea Club. Smart but approachable, profound yet whimsical, and Paul is exactly the kind of author we adore. Warm, clever, curious, contrarian, and above all else, deeply knowledgeable. There's a reason why his last book, The Sweet Spot, The Pleasures of Suffering and the Search for Meaning, was chosen by our curators, Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink, as one of the best works of nonfiction published in 2021. What I especially enjoy about Paul is that he's one of those people who's capable of saying really interesting things, surprising things, about many different topics. And because of that, we covered a ton of ground in our interview. The origins of human consciousness, the fraught legacy of Sigmund Freud, the reliability of IQ tests, and why happiness isn't all it's cracked up to be. Paul and I had such a long, wide-ranging chat that a lot of great material did not make the cut. If you want to hear our complete 2-hour interview, which contains extended riffs on artificial intelligence, free will, and the introvert-extrovert continuum, among many other topics, you can check it out now by downloading the Next Big Idea app. If you'd rather stick with this 60-minute version, that's totally fine. I guarantee you'll still come away with a completely new understanding of and appreciation for the 3-pound wrinkly mass between your ears.
The Anxious Achiever is the podcast about your mental health and your work, where leaders from top companies, entrepreneurs, athletes, celebrities, and leading experts share how they've managed through anxiety, depression, and other mental health challenges, and how they've become better leaders in the process. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll feel seen, and you'll learn great tools and skills. And I guarantee you're going to look at leadership in a new way. Come find out why we won the Mental Health America 2023 Media Award. Get The Anxious Achiever wherever you find your podcasts.
Paul Bloom, welcome to the Next Big Idea podcast.
It is great to talk to you. Looking forward to this.
Let's start with one of your outrageous claims, which is that between our ears, we have this 3-pound wrinkly lump of meat in our skulls we call our brains. And you claim that these brains of ours give rise to all of our intelligence, all of our conscious experience. You admit that this is a shocking claim even to you. Why is it shocking?
So I say a lot of radical things in my book. I make a lot of claims where I say this may not be true. People are debating this. This is controversial. But the idea that the brain is the source of mental life is entirely non-controversial in psychology. But at the same time, I acknowledge how shocking it is. We are, I think, common sense dualists. We naturally believe that we're separate from our brains. The idea that we're just physical things is shocking and upsetting. It calls into question religious ideas. It calls into question spiritual ideas. I think I have more respect for somebody who hears this and says, oh my God, that's horrible. You have to be wrong, than someone who says, oh, ho-hum, whatever. It really is a radical idea.
It is astonishing. And as you say, it's belied by this physical experience, this mental experience we all have, that we're floating behind our eyes.
That's right. C.S. Lewis, I think, was the one who put it, said, you think you have a body, not you are a body.
Yeah.
And so when there's stories about people switching bodies or leaving their body, floating away from their body during dreaming, it makes sense. It's a very intuitive notion. And the idea that we are in some way inextricably bound to our physical selves because we are our physical selves just doesn't feel right.
As a scientist, you're very humble in the book about what we can be certain of, or somewhat certain of, how high a degree of confidence we can have about various areas of various assertions of psychology. But this seems to be at the top of the list of things we're quite certain of because of a long history of experiments, right? Where we see that if you remove or damage a part of the brain, your personality fundamentally changes.
Right. So in some way, we've known this for a long time. Everybody knew that, alcohol can inflame the passions, that caffeine or drugs can affect in different ways. Everybody knew for the longest time that a sharp blow to the head could obliterate consciousness, that dementia or various diseases could mess up your capacity for reason and rationality. But the dualist intuition is strong. And so people tried to say, well, the soul is tethered to the brain in some way, and in some way damage to the brain affects the soul, but it still exists separately. And I think that notion has been whittled away over time. You go to a conference and people are talking about the most intimate aspect of yourself, maybe your sense of morality, which is something I'm very interested in. And people are arguing about where in the brain it is. But nobody is going to stand up and say, well, it's not in the brain at all. It's in the spiritual realm. Not because they're afraid of being ostracized or something, but because there's no evidence for it. You could get people to do moral judgments. You could look at what parts of the brain are activated. And you can, to varying degrees, develop a theory of how neurons wired together in very complicated ways can give rise to something like moral understanding and moral belief.
And it seems then that we have effectively like solid state drives to some degree, right? Because I think you say at one point that when we're knocked unconscious, we lose recent memories often that have not yet been encoded. But we don't lose our longer-term memories, which would suggest that they've been encoded in some kind of solid physical manifestation in the brain. In fact, all mental life is such.
That's right. So short-term memory, your memory of the last sentence you said is just as much a physical event in the brain as the memory of your hometown. But there's a process called consolidation, where the short-term memory turns into a long-term memory. It gets etched from one part of the brain to another. And, long-term memories we have an enormous capacity for memory. And you're right, you get smacked on the head, you get in a car accident or something, it could disrupt the consolidation process and memories could get lost forever.
Well, and this would also suggest that there's somewhat of a zero-sum game when it comes to memory, right? Because we just have the 3 pounds, give or take, right, of brain. We have our 86 billion neurons, give or take, and there's only so much space. Maybe the finiteness of the human brain helps to explain why we have such bad memories.
So the capacity, you're exactly right. The capacity of our memory has to be finite because our brains are physical things. So it's in principle possible to run out of space and you have to start deleting stuff.
Right.
On the other hand, One of the findings of psychology, one of the shocking findings of psychology, and there are a few, is how bad our memories are. And
Yeah.
I don't know if I don't really think it's due to capacity limitation. I think it's more because people have the wrong idea of memory. People tend to think memory is like, I'm holding up my iPhone and recording a scene, and then it's on the memory of the iPhone, and then you get back your memories, just recover the video, and forgetting under this view is just not being able to access the memory. But if you had a good psychiatrist or you thought really hard, you could access it. And people who study memory say this picture is really mistaken. Remembering something is much more of a reconstructive event.
Yes.
And so it's reconstructed. It's your best guess as to what happens. And your guess could be helped along by your suppositions of what should have happened, your memory of stories that you told before, even memories that are extremely vivid. You swear on your life it really happened, turn out to be often dramatically false.
There's an irony there because our most deeply encoded memories, our favorite memories, we've reconstructed more times, right? Or like we have a certain set of stories we like to tell or memories we like to share. And I feel this about some of my favorite memories, that I've told the story so many times that I actually have no access to the
all you have is
experience.
access to the stories you told. And that is ironic. Our most important memories tend to be the most corrupted. There was a study actually done by some colleagues at Yale, where right after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 happened, she asked people, where were you when you heard about them? And they told her. And then she asked, I forget how many years later, where were you when you heard about it? And he said, oh, I know exactly why. And they told a story, and the story was wrong. And that, as you point out, that's the irony, because that's the sort of thing you tell people, you talk about it, you're remembering, we simplify stories, you're remembering the simplified version.
What are the takeaways of this? I mean, obviously, it's, we clearly need to be more humble, right? Yeah. I guess there are legal implications as well, aren't there?
I think a lot of psychology is really interesting and doesn't have many practical implications, just interesting to know about the mind. This does. The work on the fragility of memory and unreliability of memory, much done by the psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, has led to a revolution in the legal system. It used to be, somebody's on a witness stand and they point and they said, that was the man who shot me. And that's it. It seems irrefutable. And there's been so many cases now of DNA evidence and video evidence that sometimes somebody could totally believe that it was this person, not that person, happened here and not there, but be wrong. And now I think they've changed policies for how you do lineups and how you do photo identification. There's also cases where people have confessed to crimes that they didn't commit.
Right.
It seems
this
unbelievable.
Is astonishing.
If you have me on tape saying, I murdered this person, well, I could be lying, but how could I be mistaken about something so significant? It turns out that under pressure, people, particularly, and not everybody, but some people are more malleable than others, can be pushed. Sometimes, without any ill intent. Sometimes just, I know the guy did it. I'm just going to yell at him for a while till he fesses up. And you could create a false memory in somebody. And so the legal systems become a bit sensitive to that as well.
We talked earlier about the sensation we all have of floating in our skulls. And we've now been talking about the impermanence of our memories. It reminds me of the Milan Kundera line describing the unbearable lightness of being, which I think you could just as easily call the delightful lightness of being, right? I mean, people talk about existential angst, which I can relate with, but I think it's equally sensible to talk about existential euphoria, like we exist. Isn't that remarkable? But it gets to this question of, how did consciousness emerge in the first place? Why is it necessary to be aware of being aware? And of course, philosopher David Chalmers, who we had on the show, talks about this as the hard problem of consciousness. Do you see it as a hard problem?
Yeah, I do. I think that there are, and David Chalmers, admits this, different things we mean when we talk about consciousness. So one sort of consciousness is the philosopher Ned Block talks about access consciousness. And that's just, you're conscious of something if you get to report it. So right now I'm not conscious of my blood pressure. I can't tell you what my blood pressure is, but I am conscious of the sound of your voice. So I could talk about it and I could remember and I could think about it. There's that sense of consciousness which you could program into a computer. And it's more of a sort of informational thing. But then there's consciousness in the Chalmers sense, phenomenological consciousness, which is, what it feels like to hold your newborn, to slam your hand in a car door, to eat ice cream. There's something which is sort of ineffable about it. And it's not only mysterious how the brain gives rise to it or why the brain gives rise to it. It's also of some moral significance. So we are living in a world now, we're living in a world now with many fellow creatures, animals, and the extent to which they have experiences, I think, bears on the morality of how we treat them. And now we're creating more and more, I don't know whether to call them creatures, but intelligences.
Mm-hmm.
Blake Lemon, I think, this Google engineer, about a year ago, ended up worrying that the chatbot he was working with was sentient, was conscious.
Yeah.
And then he complained to his bosses. He said, well, if it's conscious, it's a slave. We gotta let it free. So they put him on leave. And there was a lot of people who mocked him. But I think he was, or he is, a sort of canary in a coal mine, in that this is going to become more and more common as the chatbots, as these AIs become smarter and smarter and smarter. Sooner or later, pretty much everybody's going to say, wow, that's a consciousness. Now, the problem is, just like you can't know for sure that I'm conscious, you kind of infer it. We can't know for sure what is and what isn't conscious, but it matters.
It's just an extraordinary moment, isn't it? Because, for decades, people have been debating what the utility of consciousness is, why it's emerged. I think Chalmers coined the hard problem of consciousness some like 20 plus years ago.
Yeah.
And there have been a camp that felt that it was substrate dependent, meaning that it has to emerge out of brains opposed to silicon. And I've always loved Antonio Damasio's explanation, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Damasio and his who studied the evolution of feelings. And his assertion, which I think is fascinating, we had him on the show, is that feeling preceded cognition and was a prerequisite for consciousness. Because we're these fragile creatures that evolved very quickly to begin to have these sensations of pain and pleasure to try to navigate the world. And that sensation, results in a feeling of being inside your body. And that was a necessary prerequisite for developing this experience of consciousness. That always made sense to me. But now we're really doing the experiment in real time of seeing whether consciousness or some kind of sentience can emerge on silicon. And just a week or two ago, some Microsoft researchers published a paper called Sparks of Artificial General Intelligence, Early Experiments with GPT-4, that said one of these early sparks they reported of emergent AGI was a capacity for theory of mind.
Yeah.
So it feels like, my sense has been everybody, it's fashionable to scoff at people who say that sentience may be beginning to emerge. But my view has always been, we don't understand the emergence of consciousness in humans, right? So how can we be so certain as to exactly when and how it could emerge?
Yeah, there's two really hard, very pressing questions here. And one is, it's something which we're going to get a handle on, which is how smart will these machines get? And I'll tell you, just trying maybe to set up to try to encourage the public policy of people admitting that they were wrong. I could not have imagined that there would be machines like Bing or ChatGPT. If you asked me 2 years ago, I would have said, we'll get them in 50 years, maybe.
Yeah.
And now we have them. And like a lot of people, I'm just shocked at how quickly we got them and how smart they are. Will they reach a point where they don't get any smarter? Or will they get to a point where there's artificial general intelligence and they're smarter than us in every possible way? Their relationship to you and me will be like our relationship to a 3-year-old. So that's question one.
Yeah.
But then question two is the consciousness question. Maybe we'll be dealing with a machine that could think rings around us, that can talk, can persuade us, that can figure out exactly how our minds work, but there's nothing inside. It's just a bunch of connections, of statistics, and it has no experience. But how would we know?
There's a new book out from a theoretical psychologist called Nick Humphrey called Sentience, the Invention of Consciousness. And he has a theory that sort of dovetails with what has always been my intuition, which is that he says, well, sentience was obviously a biological trait that arose through natural selection. And among social apes, it was a great advantage to be able to read people's minds, to predict the behavior of other apes. And so we had to create, this theory of mind, this model of other people's motivations and personalities. And if you can be better at predicting how other humans are going to behave, you have a great advantage in a highly social species. And the best way to do this is to understand our own motivations and have a theory of mind that applies to ourselves, understand ourselves so we can put ourselves in the shoes of others. And that this process, a theory of other minds, and then by reflected back to us a theory of our own mind, resulted in the emergence of conscious experience. So it's an interesting argument. It's a hypothesis, effectively. But what's astonishing is we're starting to see something like this with ChatGPT-4. And there was a fascinating post recently by Robert Wright, the wonderful author who wrote Non-Zero and the Moral Animal, I'm sure you're familiar with,
Yep.
Who's working on a book about cognitive empathy, who had been testing GPT-4 with lots of very complex questions about reading all the motives of a collection of humans in a given situation and understanding their various perspectives. And he was just astonished by the sophistication of GPT-4 and believes that it has developed a kind of cognitive empathy. What's interesting is we're starting to see, I think the Microsoft researchers themselves, who obviously have a partnership with OpenAI, have said that we're watching intelligence emerge not unlike the emergence of human capabilities from a young age. The theory of mind emerges in children, I think, at some age, right?
And in some way, that sort of provides a test or a challenge to Humphrey's theory. So I'm a big fan of Bob Wright and his thoughts about cognitive empathy. And if I remember right, his example is something like one of his examples he uses somebody. This may be somebody else, but the example is somebody embarrasses himself, and how does he feel after he makes a stupid mistake? How does the person whose friend feels? Suppose he's trying to impress this girl, but you like the girl. How do you feel to watch him embarrass himself in front of her? And the machine, the ChatGPT, is pretty smart about this.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Humphrey might then say that, well, maybe in order to be this smart at it, it has to be able to feel these emotions itself. But are we going to already go to the claim that it feels embarrassment and satisfaction and shame and delight and sympathy? I don't know. I don't feel I'm ready to go there quite yet. In part, and this is actually David Chalmers has spoken about this before, in part because at this point the large language models are untethered to the physical world. They're just, no, I don't want to say just, but they work through prediction of what word will follow another word,
right,
and a lot more than that, but that kind of thing. But they don't have motor control. They don't act on the world. They don't perceive the world. Maybe once we get that, So let me ask you something, because I just heard a discussion by Eric Hole and a neuroscientist and Russ Roberts, and this was turning over the issue of whether there should be a moratorium on AI research.
Yes,
that we should shut it down for a while because there's a huge threat, as we do with research into biological weapons and nuclear weapons and so on. It is getting to a point where we don't know where it's going. Do you have any sympathy for doing that?
I personally do. Yeah, we had a recent conversation with Kevin Roos, who's the New York Times reporter, with whom Sydney, also known as GPT-4, fell in love.
Yeah, tried to break up his marriage.
Tried to disrupt his marriage. And I'm of the opinion that we should err on the side of caution here.
Yeah, I've been listening to a lot of people who I respect who are pretty smart, and they're very, very worried, and I've started to get worried with them. In some way, we could talk about it the way the rationalists talk about it and say, what are the odds that AI, unfettered, keeps developing and something terrible comes from it? And if you think the odds are very small, but they're like 5%, well, that's for the destruction of our species. That's quite a worrying percentage. So I don't know.
Unacceptably high. Yeah,
unacceptably high.
When we come back, we lighten things up by talking about the naughty father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud.
Hey, I'm Michael Kovnat, host of The Next Big Idea Daily. The show is a masterclass in better living from some of the smartest writers around. Every morning, Monday through Friday, we'll serve up a quick 10-minute lesson on how to strengthen your relationships, supercharge your creativity, boost your productivity, and more. Follow The Next Big Idea Daily wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey folks, Rufus here. If you're a fan of our interviews with physicians, scientists, or entrepreneurs, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, Raising Health. Previously called BioEats World, Raising Health comes from leading venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z. Each episode, Raising Health dives deep into the heart of healthcare, biotech, and AI with A16Z general partners. Along the way, they explore the real challenges and opportunities in health and biotech entrepreneurship. Not to mention, you'll hear raw insights and actionable advice from notable guests like Omada CEO and co-founder Sean Duffy, and AI expert and InCitro CEO Daphne Kohler. Don't miss out. Follow Raising Health wherever you get your podcasts. Well, to lighten things up a bit, let's talk about Sigmund Freud. My experience growing up in the 80s in high school was that Freud was sort of thought of as one of the 3 or 4 most revolutionary thinkers of the last couple of centuries, not only in Freud's own mind, but but more broadly, right? That there was Darwin, there was Freud, maybe Marx, Einstein, these people whose thinking really changed the world. I don't think I've seen a major thinker lose credibility as dramatically as Freud has in the last several decades.
Freud has had a significant fall from grace. I'm reading from a review right now. I have this in front of me. I just pull it up. It's by a biography of Freud by Frederick Crews, and it summarizes the idea, Crews's depiction of Freud as liar, cheat, incestuous child molester, woman hater, money worshiper, chronic plagiarist, and all-around nasty nut job. And you can get a degree in psychology at a great university without ever hearing his name ever spoken. And
that's amazing.
That's not entirely mistaken. It's people, he got just about everything wrong. His claims about the anal stage, the oral stage, the primal scene, penis envy, Oedipus complex, nothing. I don't think there's any of the specifics stand up to scrutiny.
But how about the detail that a man who smooths the crease of his trousers in place before lying down on the couch reveals himself to be a coprophiliac, someone obsessed with their feces.
Yeah,
right?
he was very quick to judge, you could say. But I actually think Freud belongs in my book, and I think he belongs in training of a psychologist, and belongs. I think there's a few reasons. One thing is simply his historical prominence.
Yes.
We all kind of live in a world that was partially created by Freud. If you ever describe somebody as having an anal personality, or say to somebody, "I'm not your mother," you're channeling Freud whether you know it or not, so you should know it. I think Freud was a wonderful writer. I think he often had some extraordinary insights. For me, I think Freud's great accomplishment was he really did build a science of the mind based on the idea of a dynamic unconscious. And everything else has got sort of jettisoned away, but the notion that we don't know why we do what we do has remained, and I think is right, and I think is important.
Certainly, there were references in poetry and literature and so on to this notion that people have desires and the unconscious was to some degree understood vaguely before Freud, but your view would be that he was pretty critical to helping the whole world understand more broadly that there's so much of what we think and feel that's inaccessible to our conscious minds.
That's right. Even Freud himself, who was not, who was very quick to take credit for everything, conceded that the notion of an unconscious was around long before him. But like you say, I think Freud tried to build a psychology out of it. And, even though he got everything wrong, it was the right general idea.
And, well, there's also, as you say, I'm quoting you here, something liberating about his openness to sexuality. And you say, I love this line, if everyone is a pervert, perhaps nobody is a pervert.
Thank you. I'm very fond of that line. I find writing so hard, but I wrote that line and I kind of chuckle. Oh, that's really clever.
Well,
I hope one day somebody will quote it back to me. So I'm very happy.
It's great news for perverts everywhere, which Freud would say is all of us.
Yes. So Freud was, I think Freud clearly overemphasized sex. I mean, he couldn't. It was everywhere for Freud, everywhere and everything. But everyone else was underemphasizing it.
Yes.
Freud would talk quite candidly about his sexual desires of women, which was not a thing among his contemporaries. It was shocking to his contemporaries. He would basically argue your sort of average person is filled with desires which one might call perverted. And there's something, I do think there's something liberating about that for people who are sexual minorities of some sort or another, to realize that they're just, one set of perverts among many.
Well, my mother, a retired psychoanalyst, will be delighted that we found a few nice things to say about Freud in the conversation.
It's unusual these days, but yeah.
Let's talk about mental disorders. I was really surprised to read in your book that the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health recently said, no new drug targets or therapeutic mechanisms of real consequence have been developed for more than 4 decades. So it seems like we've been maybe a little stuck when it comes to making progress on treating serious mental disorders.
I try to be candid in the book about the problems of psychology. We've gone through a replication crisis, which is quite serious, affecting social psychology, developmental psychology, cognitive psychology. But clinical has its own problem, which is I don't think we've made a huge amount of progress in the last few decades. Our drugs are not demonstratively better than they were a while ago. Our talk therapy is kind of like if you were seeing a therapist in 1990, it wouldn't be so different from seeing a therapist now. And I'm not sure why this is so. I kind of know why it's so for the drugs, which has to do with financial incentives. People have written about this. It's just very expensive to develop a new drug. So it's much better to simply take an old drug, tweak it, give it a new name and market it, rather than try something totally new. What some people will say, and I hope they're right, is that revolution is just around the corner. Maybe it's psychedelics. Maybe it's some sort of brain stimulation, little electric shocks and mild electric shocks in the right area make your depression go away. Maybe it's mindfulness, though I think that's currently being used a lot and is of some use, but not a revolution. I mean, I'll also say that, as I'm very much stressed in the book, that our best evidence suggests therapy and drugs do work. They're better than not doing them.
And you say that all disorders exist on a continuum, and this has implications for neurodiversity. That's interesting to me. How so?
So there's a big debate over whether disorders are categorical or continuous. So,
right.
And I wouldn't say all disorders. I think there are some which really are. Parkinson's. You either can't. You could vary in intensity. Sure. It's not like it's a smooth gradient from normal to Parkinson's. Some things sort of stand out as separate categories. But the idea here is that when you think about anxiety or depression, there's a temptation to see it as something you have or you don't. And the claim for anxiety and depression is it's on a continuum. There are people who are very cheerful, and there are people who are sad, and there are people who are sadder. And at a certain point, you say, that's a disorder. And the issue of neurodiversity comes in because the point at which you say that's a disorder isn't so much a sort of scientific question. It's a practical one. It's a moral one. It's a political one. There are some people who on extremes who say there's no such thing as mental illness. This is a stigmatizing term. Society should change to make the world better for people who are different. And I think in an extreme version, that's nonsense. You see somebody who has schizophrenia, who has severe depression, who has a social phobia, they can't leave the house. These people are living in misery. I think something like severe schizophrenia, severe depression should be thought of as akin to cancer, which is you want to cure it. But there is a question of where you do the cutoff. And where I'm sort of on board with neurodiversity is I think sometimes society should change in order to make things better for people who don't match our normal way of thinking, who are not, who are neurodiverse. So one good case is autism. Severe autism. My brother has severe autism. He doesn't speak. He never will speak. He will never be able to live by himself. He will never be able to have a romantic relationship or a friendship. To me, that's like cancer. Be great to cure it.
Yeah.
But there are some people who have what's called autism, and it manifests itself in just a different way of thinking. In some way, possibly a better way of thinking.
Yeah, but Elon Musk has described himself
Yes.
as being on the spectrum, right? So this would be sort of the Asperger's zone.
That's right. And as you enter that zone, there's a certain, as you enter the zone, maybe the idea is, well, it's just another way of being. You should respect it.
Well, and you point out that there's this arbitrary line we draw as to when a proclivity becomes a mental disorder. And so depression, you said something like more than 2 weeks of the sort of sense of depression or helplessness or whatever it is. And we say, okay, well, depression after the death of a spouse or a loved one is logical. And I think it's Johann Hari in his book, Lost Connections, who makes this fascinating case that okay, well, if we think it's logical that someone's depressed for 3 months or 6 months after the death of a loved one, doesn't it make sense to be depressed if you're trapped in a horrible job or a horrible marriage? Here's this wonderful quote from Hari. Depression is, in fact, a form of grief for our own lives not being lived as they should. A form of grief for the connections we've lost, which is quite powerful. And I guess from that perspective, one could see an increase in incidences of depression at scale of a society as an indication that there's something wrong with that society, that maybe people are inadequately connected, or there's a collective grief.
Yeah, or equivalently, one could see gains in happiness over time in a society as showing opposite, which is things are going pretty well. Society's doing things right. No, I agree with that. I mean, I worry that sometimes what Hari misses in this is that two people can be in the same situation, and one can get horrifically depressed, another one is resilient and shoulders through. And so you have to, in some ways, sometimes depression isn't the right reaction to it. Maybe sadness, but you should respond with resilience. The death of a child is a case where you'd expect everybody to become deeply, deeply filled with grief. But, if you're living your life and you find it, you're filled with sadness because of the struggles of living your life, but it's actually, not a bad life, then maybe something's gone awry. Maybe an analogy is there are people with chronic pain, and they feel great pain, even though there's nothing that wrong with their bodies, but something is wrong with their brain that leads them to have great pain.
Well, when we think about how our understanding of human behavior has changed since the days of Freud and in recent decades, in the perennial nature versus nurture debates, how much is genes and how much is environment, it seems that the pendulum has swung in recent decades more towards nature. That genetics plays a larger role than maybe we once thought in determining our path. Would you say that's true?
Yeah. I mean, there's two questions about nature and nurture. One concerns universals, things we all have. So to what extent is our visual system, or our capacity for language, our ability to walk, our ability to have short-term memories, to what extent is that shaped by our genes versus our environment? And here I'm kind of nativist. I think there's a lot of shaping force of our environment, but I think there's a fundamental human blueprint that is part of our nature that shows up. Then the other question is differences. So why is one person more extroverted than another? Why is one person smarter than another? And so on. And there has been, I think for a long while in our history, people thought it was entirely environment. And there's been enough research suggesting that just as with the body, the brain is shaped to a significant degree by genes. So if I wanted to know how extroverted you are, or how aggressive, or how clever, if I know the extroversion, aggressiveness, or cleverness of your biological mother and father, I could predict where you would be to some extent, even if they don't raise you, even if you're raised by other people.
Yeah, but there's this fascinating data point that when you look at the big five personality traits of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeability, and neuroticism, that on average, apparently, women have higher levels of neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. You write, if you took a random person and gave them a personality test, you'd have an 85% success rate at assessing whether that individual is a man or a woman.
Right. So there we get to group differences. And there's some evidence. And in fact, there's evidence that using these very broad personality scales underestimates the differences.
Sure.
But again, I mean, one thing which is really critical to mention is we're talking about overlapping bell curves. And
yes.
And so there's two things that follow from it, which is say take height. Men are on average taller than women.
Yes. Yes.
To a certainly significant degree. But there's a lot of women who are taller than the average man, a lot of men who are shorter than the average woman. But the difference in overlap means at the extremes, you get a pretty strong sex ratio. So if you're looking at people, I don't have the numbers at my fingertip, you're looking at people over 6'4". There's probably like 1,000 to 1 ratio for men because just the difference is exaggerated. Similarly, men are somewhat more aggressive than women. But and this is not good for does not reflect nicely on men. If you look at people who are bizarrely, extremely psychotically aggressive, they're far more likely to be men.
Well, and when we look at the group differences, I love this little factoid. Liberals score higher on openness, looking at the big five personality traits. Conservatives score higher on conscientiousness. And you point out that these are both positive qualities.
It's nice to have a finding which everybody agrees on, as opposed to this group is stupid or this group is
right. I mean, probably immoral. Most people would be like, okay, I'm conservative and I'm more conscientious than most liberals, or I'm liberal and I'm more open than most conservatives. Maybe everybody's happy with that outcome. I was amused by this distinction between maximizers and satisficers, right? Maximizers seek out what's best. Satisficers go for what's good enough. And I think you said that in your marriage, there's a clear distinction.
Yes. This is the one bit of pop psychology which has slipped into my book because this is a little bit of pop psychology. But I looked at the literature, and there is a literature on this, and this is a sort of a legitimate psychological difference, a way to categorize different people. Maximizers are people who will spend a long time scrutinizing a menu and picking up the best dish. Satisficers just glances and he says, I'll have this. Satisficers, they get in the car, there's a radio station playing, they listen. Maximizers slow down and carefully turn the station until they get something exactly right. And I'm pretty much of a satisficer, and I'm married to pretty much of a maximizer.
No, as soon as I read this passage, I handed the book to my wife.
And what is she and what are you?
And asked her, well, it's very clear to me that she's a maximizer and I'm a satisficer. So I feel your pain and joy and everything in between.
In some way, it means we're both free riders, because maximizers often work to make sure there's the best of everything. And they go through all the agonies to determine this, while we go, we don't care that much.
That's true. Yeah. Well, and you say maximizers tend to do better at life in objective ways, like getting better jobs, because they effectively have higher standards, and they're fighting for a more optimal outcome. But there's some evidence that they can be on average less happy. And you point out that I think it took your wife 6 months to select a desk chair, and this might be because they don't have a desk chair to sit on.
Yes. So she did find ultimately the best chair, but it took her a while. I would have just gone to IKEA and grabbed that chair and then just take it home.
Well, her delight with the desk chair she selected may offset the 6 months of crouching. Let's talk about IQ, right? Which is a controversial topic, but also one on which there's a lot of data, and it's quite interesting section of the book. Do you want to tell us about your findings or the collective findings we have on IQ and how it impacts your life?
So IQ is your score on a certain test. What people are interested in is some sort of construct known as intelligence, which probably is a cluster of related things. And, the test is reasonably good at assessing people's intelligence. And one reason why we know that is that it correlates with so many good things. So people who have higher IQs, they make more money, they tend to be kinder, tend to be less racist, less sexist. They live longer. They're healthier. They do better at their job, whether their job is, as a scholar or working in the Coast Guard or just about anything. The military uses IQ tests because they really do have tremendous predictive power. If you're stuck and you had to know one number about a person to be able to predict their fate, their IQ would be the number to use. But there's an immediate qualification here, which I do make in the book, and I think is important. I think it's often missed, which is to some extent the importance of IQ is a self-fulfilling prophecy set up by our society.
Yeah.
So I'm not denying that being smart is good. I think if you're a hunter-gatherer, it's better to be smart than less smart. But our society, United States in particular, say, really, really values intelligence. So what we do is we have universities, including elite universities. And to get into the elite universities, you have to score high on SATs and GREs and LSATs, which are basically IQ tests. And if you don't score high, then for the most part, it's a lot harder to get an elite university career. And for the most part, that means your life is less good. So in some way, IQ matters to such a degree because we set it up. We say, unless you have a high IQ, it's hard to get into Yale, Harvard, Princeton. And if you don't get a Yale, Harvard, Princeton, you're not going to end up being the super elite in this country.
On the list of effects or things correlated with high IQ, some of the more surprising ones, I was surprised by the kinder one. I would not necessarily have guessed that, but that people with higher IQ also exercise more and are less likely to smoke.
There might be some correlation with conscientiousness, with what Angela Duckworth calls grit. I think the kindness is because smart people can look out for can plan for the future in an intelligent way, which often involves being kind to people.
Yeah.
Suppose I have to deal with you regularly, and I'm very tempted to cheat you, or defraud you, or just steal from you. But it's not in my future long-term interest. Just selfishly, it's better for me to keep dealing with you indefinitely, which requires treating you fairly and with respect. There's two ways I could falter. One is I could have low self-control, where all of a sudden, we're trading something and I just grab your stuff and run away with it because I can't resist. But the second way is I may not be smart enough to realize that I'm just shooting myself in the foot. And intelligent people are smart enough to realize that sometimes you have to defer some sort of, exploitation just because it works out for you better in the end.
Yeah, I love the notion that altruism and kindness are actually good life strategies. To me, this makes the case for rather than seeing sort of people who act in more selfish ways as acting out of self-interest, they're actually not acting out of self-interest well enough, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's a better strategy to be kind, to be generous. And I think that from my perspective, that understanding can cause us to have less of a sense of sort of moral superiority, which liberals are sometimes guilty of, right? Which I think is kind of a dangerous tendency.
I think that's right. I think there's a lot of sources for altruism and kindness, and some of it really is a sort of abstract concern for others. I know there are cynical people who deny such a thing exists, but I think it does exist.
Yeah, absolutely.
But sometimes it is a sort of intelligent, self-interested thing where, certainly in a community, in a tight-knit community, in a society, in a corporation, having the reputation for kindness means people want to interact with you.
How do you feel about Carol Dweck's growth mindset, and how much can we grow IQ? And we know there's been this Flynn effect that people have been getting smarter on average for up until maybe recently.
So there's sort of two questions here. One question is, Carol Dweck's work itself suggests that a belief that IQ is flexible and can change, or it's any sort of skill, is a good belief to have. It makes people persevere. They take on harder projects and everything. I know there's been work that has explored this, some of it critically, and maybe the effect, as always with psychology, maybe the effect isn't as big as it was originally reported, but it does seem to be an effect. She does seem to be, I think, right in this. The second claim is, can IQ actually go up and down? And I think to some extent it can. I think that certainly if your IQ, if your intelligence is hampered because you're living in an environment which is poisonous to you, or you're undereducated, or you're being treated savagely, you get huge jumps of IQ. Some of the studies find that to take a kid who's raised in a terrible way and then put him or her into a good family causes a big jump. Moving us a bit older, there's a small IQ gain for each year you spend in university. Cynics might say that's just because you become better at taking the tests. But I think that there are environments that flourish IQ and environments that diminish it.
Yeah.
And not just IQ intelligence more generally.
There's an open question, isn't there, about to what extent intelligence all aligns on the same axis of, like, if you're better at math, you're also better at understanding other people, for instance. Is that true or is it not true? Versus this notion of having different kinds of intelligence. My personal change of perspective in the last 30, 40 years has been in the direction of seeing more different kinds of intelligence and having somewhat of a view that, let's say, to expand on that earlier point, that math skills and sort of emotional intelligence, or the ability to understand or empathize or connect with other people, don't strike me as being terribly correlated. So how do you think about, and one could say, if one believes that to be true, having a singular IQ test that everybody's submitted to would do an injustice both to the employers who are using it to make decisions and to the people taking the test. So what do you think about that?
So the standard intelligence test is in some way a test of multiple intelligences, right? So they ask you about your math, and you have the vocabulary test and spatial rotation. And it makes sense. You might have imagined that, people who are good at math are bad at words. It turns out, though, maybe for interesting reasons, that there is a pretty high correlation between them. A good analogy is athletic skills, right? So imagine we did a how fit are you test. And so it involves how much can you bench press, how fast can you run, what yoga positions can you get into. And you could really imagine somebody being a really great marathoner, but can't lift very much, or something like that.
Sure.
But it would so happen, if you gave that test to 10,000 people, that on the whole, there'd be a correlation. A healthy, fit 21-year-old would do great at all of those things, or pretty good at all those things. A very sickly 90-year-old would do poorly at all of those things. And intelligence seems to be the same way, at least within the sort of parameters that are usually tested for an intelligence test. One of the big surprises is it's correlated. You're better than average at math, you're likely to be better than average at verbal skills, you're likely to be better at average at doing analogies or spatial relationships. Now, when you start looking at the sort of broader multiple intelligence thing, so, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, my understanding is there still exists a correlation, maybe not as large. But if you find somebody who has an IQ of, very standard IQ of very high, my bet is they'll probably be better than average on these other forms of intelligence.
Coming up, we get to the bottom of the age-old question, does money make you happy? And if so, how much? The Next Big Idea is sponsored by the Next Big Idea Club. That's right. The Next Big Idea is more than just a scintillating podcast with a debonair host. It's part of the coolest learning platform on the planet. Here's how it works. Every season, our curators, Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink, handpick dozens of the best new books. Then we partner with the authors of those books to create Book Bites. These are 12-minute audio summaries written and read by the authors themselves, and the only place you can find them is in the Next Big Idea app. And that's not all you'll find once you download it. Our app also has beautiful audio and video e-courses, ad-free versions of this podcast, bonus author conversations, and lots of other mind-expanding content. Download the Next Big Idea app today. Better yet, do it right now. Pause this recording, go to your app store, and search for Next Big Idea. Getting smarter has never been so easy. It's just in the final chapter of the book that you give yourself permission to address a topic of great broad interest, which is, positive psychology. What makes us happy?
Yeah.
Let's talk about money and happiness. It's actually quite obvious that money would make people happy. We talk about it as if that's counterintuitive, and there's been some debate. I remember for years everybody said, "Oh, well, having more money, having more income makes people happier up to $75,000 a year of income, and then it no longer has an effect." More recent studies have suggested, for better or for worse, the effect continues. Why do you think it's obvious that more money should make people happier?
Yeah, and I've been around long enough that I remember, to my embarrassment, lecturing intro psych students by saying, "Isn't it amazing that money doesn't make you happy?" Because that's what the initial studies, which were not well done,
interesting.
Found.
Okay.
But it's pretty clear it doesn't be amazing if it didn't. I mean, money can buy you time with your family and friends. Money could buy you medical care. Money could buy you better food, travel, freedom from dangerous circumstances, the ability to not to work in a degrading or dangerous job, in every possible way, differing across countries. So in some countries, money is essential to get medical care for you and the ones you love. Other countries have more of a safety net. But still, money matters. And so common sense is right. Better to make it a lot of money than a little bit of money. Common sense is also right in saying that there's diminishing returns. And this kind of makes sense too. If you make $50,000 a year and somebody offers you another $50,000, that's going to transform you. But if you're making $500,000 a year, it has less of an effect. So yeah, money is connected with happiness. I will say though, and this is something Dan Gilbert talks about a lot, that particularly at the high end, the difference isn't so much that you should give up other things. So the biggest connector to happiness, probably besides your genes, is social connectedness. Being with people you love, who respect you, who treat you kindly, who you have fun with. And you might be doing the math wrong if you make a healthy income and you decide to make a little bit more money, but that keeps you busy so you don't spend time with friends and family. That might just be, from a purely hedonic point of view, a mistake.
Then you cite the surprising data point that people who believe they need money to be happy are less happy.
Yeah.
Right. Which you say, it sounds like you should inherit money or maybe make money accidentally. Like, how do we explain that?
I think the core finding here is that people who strive to become happy, the core finding, people who strive to become happy tend to be less happy on average. Now, I got to be a little bit cautious here because this is a sort of psych finding you can imagine going both ways. Maybe the striving makes you unhappy, which is a story I like to tell a little bit, and the authors of the work like to tell. But maybe people who are unhappy strive more. So it's kind of hard to pull apart. But regardless, it seems like there's a lovely study I summarize in the book, which looks at the happiest people in the world. So they look at people, there's these large scale studies, and look at people who are like 9 or 10 on a 10-point scale of how happy you are. All sorts of other scales. They're just blissing out. And so what are these people like? And and what you see is it's everything. They're healthier, they exercise more, they're more curious. They do make more money, not a staggering amount more money, but they make more money. But mostly it's social connectedness. And so I feel these people, it's not that they're spending all their time gritting their teeth making money, and nor are they spending all their time gritting their teeth saying, I got to be happier. These are people who just spend a lot of time with those they love.
One of the most fascinating observations in your happiness chapter for me was this idea that happiness is not, in fact, a state, but rather it's a signal that our life is going as we would like it to. If we think of happiness not as itself the state that one wants to achieve, but rather it's a signal of whether we're doing things right, we might note that, hey, when we connect more with our loved ones and we're more generous and kind, that we're happier. If we learn from that signal, we will end up happier more of the time.
I think it's in some ways more complicated than that. I argue in my last book, and I wave at this in this last chapter, that I'm a motivational pluralist.
Yes,
so I think there's more to life than being happy. There's also establishing meaning. There's being a good person. There's other things we might want besides happiness. But happiness is a fairly good indicator.
And I think part of the problem here is a semantic one, right? That it just feels inadequate as a word. It kind of sounds sugary, right? Like something. I feel like we need a new word like umami for taste, right? We needed a new word to describe taste experience, and we need an umami for happiness that captures some layers of human satisfaction that are not simple. And this is in the direction of supporting the thesis of your last book, which is that we humans have motivational pluralism, right? That there's not a single thing that we want or aspire to, but a range of gratifying experiences.
I think that's right. I think that, and there it's not a psychological claim. I mean, this is more of a philosophical or moral claim. As a psychologist, I could ask, what makes you happy, and look at different influencers. But, moving outside that, we could also ask as people, is there more to life than being happy? And I think that there is.
Well, Paul, this conversation has made me happy. Thank you for taking some time out of your afternoon to be with us. Both The Sweet Spot and Psych, The Story of the Human Mind, are phenomenal reads, as are your prior books. And so I hope our listeners get a chance to enjoy them. And thank you again for being with us today.
Well, thank you. This has been a delight. I hope we have a chance to do this again.
That was Paul Bloom, author of Psych, The Story of the Human Mind. Paul's last book, The Sweet Spot, was chosen by our curators, Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink, as one of the 8 best works of nonfiction published in 2021. And Paul spoke about the book with one of those curators, Susan Cain, on this podcast. You can find their interview by scrolling back through this feed. There's also a link in the show notes. Next week, The Happiness Project's Gretchen Rubin takes me on a thrilling tour of my 5 senses. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger, sound designed by Mike Toda. The Next Big Idea is a proud member of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.